Good morning, and thank you for
Good
being
morning.
here. I'm just wondering, from a governance perspective, what would you say, or how would you say you get the most value from your board? And what would be the one thing that your boards could do differently to provide additional value or greater support to what you do? Thank you.
You know, the one thing that I would like to see my board do more of is assist with fundraising. And again, somewhat surprisingly, given we are a not-for-profit, we're also a charity, but similar to Kelly's organization, we don't rely heavily on sort of donations. It's more a sponsorship approach. But our board of directors job descriptions don't actually include supporting fundraising, and there's no understanding that individual directors will contribute to the cause. And many of you who sit on boards are aware that, you know, often when you sit on a not-for-profit board, in particular a charity and in particular a health charity, there is an expectation that you would contribute. I would be quite happy if my board was a little more active in supporting our fundraising efforts. So that's certainly something that I'm working on with my board chair to try and encourage that behavior. But of course, then you have to have the right people on the board, and that can be a slightly longer-term proposition, is recruiting them and making clear that expectation when they're recruited that they are going to be expected to help with that. And that's in addition to the professional fundraising staff that you have, and it's absolutely key that you've got that good team, but you still need doors opening and introductions made. So that would be one area.
Question over here. I'm Deborah Gardner. I'm the Executive Director of Volunteer Toronto. I'd like to acknowledge your insightful and passionate comments, but I would like to know your opinion on people moving from the for-profit world into the non-profit world, where I've been living for the past 30 years, and going to nonprofit agencies that don't have multi-million-dollar budgets, but that are part of the community, particularly in Toronto, where there are over 2,000 nonprofit agencies. Making that transition to smaller nonprofits, how you would see that as a positive move or a challenging move?
Maybe I'll try. We have, I came out of the private sector and worked as a volunteer for many years, but we have 4 vice presidents at Princess Margaret. 2 came from the private sector and 2 came from the not-for-profit sector. And I think the most successful organizations, whether they're, you know, there are really strong of those 80,000 not-for-profit sector or organizations Rocco mentioned. There are not-for-profits with a couple people that are powerful and do great work. Doesn't matter how small or how big you are. I think that the best practice for the not-for-profit sector is to marry this combination of people out of the private sector and the not-for-profit sector. Not too heavy on either side. Equal numbers in terms of the senior management team at Princess Margaret has really worked for us so far.
And Nicholas, may I also add? I actually believe that in the sector that I'm working in now, I've never actually met people who have such smarts, energy, expertise, or passion. And that's from whether they come from a very small or very large not-for-profit organization. I do believe, though, that we will not be able to, and I know I've said this 3 times, so I apologize, but to go out and change the world unless we work together. And so Participation in the physical activity and sport participation sector has been working extremely hard to knit the fabric of Canadian not-for-profit in my sector, weave it together. And so we're working with the not-for-profit organizations to pull us together, so we're having common conversations, we're aligning our missions, we're aligning our communications, we're aligning our resources. And so my job at Participation, because we have this phenomenal brand, it has 85% brand recognition. I take no credit for that. Those are my predecessors that set that up. But we have this amazing brand, so we can attract dollars to the sector, but our job is then to deploy those resources out to those smaller organizations who are doing phenomenal work but don't have access to the capital. And so we are working extremely hard in our sector to bring those not-for-profit organizations together. We have conversations. We actually put business plans together so that we can marshal our resources, let me say, much more efficiently.
I would just add, because it's a very important question around fit and likely success of a transition. And being in a very small charity is very different than being in a large charity. You park your job description at the door because you're chief bottle washer and cook. In smaller organizations, they're is a lack of capacity to do the things that you would take for granted in some for-profit situation. So we can talk blithely about have a strategic plan, have a have budgets. You're going into a shop of one or two people. It's a different world. So you have to be prepared to go in with your eyes open. And I would never consider hiring someone into the not-for-profit who's not demonstrated through volunteer work themselves that they understand what it's about. It's a very, very valid and important question, and people should consider it in terms of thinking about fit.
Thank you. Good morning, Susan Barrett. I really appreciate the insight so far, and I'd like to ask what might be a slightly indelicate question, but for all of you, and I know you're in different sized charities, and Paul, you talked about the fundraising, the money part. I'd like to know how you felt, or perhaps how your significant others felt, when you saw the reality of that first paycheck, and how that transition is made, both mentally and in terms of reality and in one's life.
Who wants to go? Sarah?
Sure. I mean, I'll jump in. Can't comment on the significant other, but certainly, you know going in that this is going to be part of the trade-off. It was less so for me in the most recent transition, but more when I moved from private sector law practice into the Ontario government. I took maybe a 30% pay cut, but I have to tell you that looking back at it, and even at the time, there were no regrets. There were absolutely no regrets. So I think what does become key is, figuring out if you have the passion for the particular role, and then really looking at it in the cold light of day and saying, okay, the money is not going to be where I get my, juice from. I've got to get that somewhere else, and figuring out whether that job can deliver it for you. So yes, it's a trade-off, but speaking personally, I've never regretted that.
I regretted it a little bit when the stock market collapsed.
Right.
I have to say, but my biggest advice would be to pick your spouse wisely, because it is perhaps the most significant choice you'll ever make, and the spouse has to be with you on it. Actually, Ronnie would like me to go back to the not-for-profit because going political has actually halved my income again. But to Sarah's point, this is about finding the cause that moves you, and you'll know when that is. No one can tell you. I woke up after the sort of the visit from the ghost of Christmas future, and looked at myself and what I was doing, and just couldn't look at my son and jibe what I was trying to tell him were important values and not live it. And so the payback has to be that what you do resonates with what's important for you. And only you will know when you've reached that point of pain of compromising what it is that you really believe in to do something else because it pays better.
Look, I don't want to, we're all talking about this point, but I think this is a central point, one of the things that you're all here this morning to explore. And I'll make a very personal comment on this. I used to organize my life around the question, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich? And, I think of people, wow, they're really smart, or if they're so smart, why aren't they rich? And after, seeing somebody die that I loved of cancer, I totally changed my question from, if you're so smart, why aren't you rich, to if you're so smart, why aren't you happy? Because I had an opportunity to, have friends and associates and others through YPO, people who had made a lot of money, and, that didn't make them happy. And the reason that I'm in the not-for-profit sector, and I'm at my job for 6 years, because this is the best job I've ever had. And I made a lot more money. I make less than 5% of what I made in 1999, my last year in the private sector. But it's the best job I've ever had, and I'm happier than I've ever been. And I think that's the basic question you got to ask yourself.